The Mafia boss thought he owned the city, but the city already belonged to someone new. The amber whiskey caught the dying light of October 1924 as Vincent, the King Torino, raised his crystal tumbler to the grimy window of his penthouse office. Below, Chicago's streets pulsed with the rhythm of commerce and corruption, a symphony he'd conducted for the better part of a decade. The Torino family had clawed their way up from the stockyards to the skyscrapers, leaving a trail of broken bones and shattered allegiances in their wake. Vincent's reflection stared back at him, sharp cheekbones carved by hunger and ambition, dark eyes that had witnessed more blood than most men saw in a lifetime of war. At 38, he wore his power like an expensive overcoat, tailored to intimidate and impress in equal measure. The scar running from his left ear to his jawline served as a permanent reminder of the night he'd earned his crown, courtesy of Mickey Flanagan's switchblade and his own stubborn refusal to die. "Boss, we got a problem." Tommy Marcelli's gravelly voice cut through Vincent's meditation. The stocky lieutenant stood in the doorway, his usually immaculate suit wrinkled with the kind of urgency that made Vincent's trigger finger itch. "There's always a problem, Tommy. That's why God invented bullets." Vincent didn't turn from the window. The streets below teemed with life, honest workers heading home to their families, and the not-so-honest ones just beginning their night shifts. Both paid tribute to the Torino Empire, whether they knew it or not. This one's different. 3 of our collection crews didn't report back from the south side today. Mickey Kowalski found 2 of the boys floating in the river this morning. And the 3rd? Tommy paused, swallowing hard. The 3rd was delivered to our warehouse in pieces. That got Vincent's attention. He turned slowly, the whiskey forgotten in his hand. Mickey Kowalski ran the docks with an iron fist and a loose tongue. If he was spooked enough to call it in personally, something seismic was shifting in the city's criminal landscape. "Who's moving on our territory?" Vincent's voice dropped to the kind of quiet that preceded violence. He'd built his reputation on the principle that crossing the Torinos was tantamount to signing one's own death warrant. "That's the thing, boss. Nobody knows. The witnesses we found are too scared to talk, and the ones who might talk are turning up dead before we can get to them. It's like fighting shadows." Vincent moved to his desk, a massive mahogany monstrosity that had belonged to Big Bill Thompson before an unfortunate disagreement about municipal contracts had left the former politician in no position to need furniture. The desktop was immaculate except for a silver letter opener and a photograph of Vincent's late father, Salvatore, who died believing his son would never amount to more than a 2-bit numbers runner. "You'll double the guards on all our operations. Move the money from the Riverside warehouse to the backup location on Michigan Avenue. And Tommy," Vincent's eyes met his lieutenant's, "I want every rat, pigeon, and stool pigeon we've got on payroll working overtime. Someone's making a play for our city, and I intend to know who before they realize they've picked a fight with the wrong family." Tommy nodded and turned to leave, but Vincent's voice stopped him at the threshold. "And Tommy, tell the boys that anyone who brings me solid information about our mysterious competitors gets a bonus. Anyone who brings me their head gets a promotion." As the door closed behind his lieutenant, Vincent returned to the window. The city lights were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows between the buildings. Chicago had always been a city of shadows. In the stockyards, the speakeasies, the back rooms where deals were made and lives were bartered. But Vincent had learned to navigate those shadows like a man born to darkness. The telephone's shrill ring pierced the quiet of his office. Vincent let it ring twice before answering, a habit that suggested importance even when discussing the mundane details of illegal liquor shipments. "Torino, Mr. Vincent, this is Father McKenna down at St. Patrick's." The priest's voice carried the weight of bad news, even filtered through the static of the telephone connection. "Johnny, Father, what can I do for you?" Vincent had maintained cordial relations with the clergy. It was good for business and better for the soul, assuming one still possessed such a thing. "I'm afraid I have some disturbing news. Your cousin Angelo was found this evening behind the cathedral. He'd been worked over pretty thoroughly before they killed him." "I'm sorry, Vincent. I know you two were close." The whiskey glass shattered against the opposite wall before Vincent realized he'd thrown it. Angelo Torino had been more than a cousin. He'd been Vincent's first lieutenant, the man who'd helped build the empire from a handful of neighborhood rackets into a sprawling criminal enterprise. More importantly, Angelo had been family, and the Torino family protected its own with the fervor of a religious conviction. "Father, was there a message?" "Something left with the body." A pause. There was a note. Yes, it simply said, "The city has a new management. Adjust accordingly." Vincent's laugh was devoid of humor, a sound like grinding glass. "Father, I appreciate the call. Please see that Angelo gets a proper funeral. Send me the bill." After hanging up, Vincent stood motionless in his office, surrounded by the trappings of power that suddenly felt as substantial as smoke. Someone was dismantling his organization piece by piece, and they were doing it with the kind of precision that suggested inside knowledge. The question wasn't whether he was at war. The question was how long the war had been going on without him realizing it. He moved to the wall safe hidden behind a portrait of his mother and retrieved a .38 Special, checking the cylinder out of habit before sliding it into his shoulder holster. If someone wanted to crown themselves King of Chicago, they'd have to pry the title from Vincent Torino's cold, dead fingers. The game had changed, but Vincent had been playing variations of this game since he was old enough to hold a knife. As he prepared to descend into the Chicago night, one thought echoed through his mind with crystalline clarity. Crowns were worn by kings, but they were won by killers. And Vincent Torino had never lost a fight he truly wanted to win. The riverside warehouse reeked of fish, machine oil, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Vincent stood in the center of the cavernous space, his breath visible in the November cold, surveying the aftermath of what could only be described as a professional execution. 12 of his best men lay arranged in a neat row, each with a single bullet to the back of the head. Their weapons were gone, their money untouched, and their faces bore expressions of surprise that suggested they'd known their killers. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," muttered Salvatore. Sally DeMarco, Vincent's oldest friend and most trusted advisor. At 52, Sally had seen enough violence to fill several lifetimes, but this methodical butchery clearly unsettled him. This ain't some punk kids trying to make a name. This is military precision. Vincent crouched beside the body of Frank Castellano, a kid from the old neighborhood who joined the organization just 6 months earlier. Frank's mother made the best Sunday gravy in Little Italy, and she'd never forgive Vincent for getting her boy killed. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like lead. Check their pockets again. Look for anything. Matchbooks, theater tickets, anything that might tell us where they went before they came here. Vincent's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he closed Frank's eyes. Leadership meant carrying the guilt for every decision, good and bad. Mickey Kowalski emerged from the shadows near the loading dock, his weathered face grim. "Boss, we got company coming. 3 black Packards, moving slow and deliberate. Could be cops, could be feds, could be our new friends." Vincent straightened, his mind racing through options. The warehouse was defensible but isolated, perfect for an ambush. If their mysterious enemies had orchestrated this discovery to draw him out, they'd succeeded. But Vincent hadn't survived a decade in Chicago's underworld by backing down from a fight. "Sally, take Mickey and 4 men out the back. Circle around and come up behind them. I want to know who's in those cars before they know we're here." Vincent drew his pistol, checking the action one final time. "And boys, take one alive if you can. Dead men tell no tales, but scared men sing like canaries." The sound of automobile engines grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the grimy windows, Vincent could see the headlights approaching, 3 vehicles in perfect formation, moving with the kind of discipline that suggested either law enforcement or military training. Given recent events, he suspected neither. A voice called out from beyond the main entrance, cultured and calm. "Mr. Torino, we'd like to have a word. We're not here for violence, merely conversation." Vincent exchanged glances with the 6 men who'd remained with him. Tony Marcelli had his Thompson submachine gun trained on the door, while little Pete Rossini covered the side windows with a sawed-off shotgun. They were good men, loyal soldiers who'd follow him into hell if necessary. He hoped it wouldn't come to that tonight. "You'll forgive me if I'm not feeling particularly conversational," Vincent called back. "Your friends made quite a mess here earlier. Cleanup's going to cost me a fortune." A pause, then footsteps approaching the entrance. Vincent nodded to his men, who melted into defensive positions behind crates and machinery. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional drip of water from the leaking roof. The doors opened slowly, and 3 figures entered. The first was a woman, tall, elegant, wearing a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Her auburn hair was styled in the latest fashion, and her green eyes surveyed the warehouse with the cool assessment of a general reviewing troops. She couldn't have been older than 25, but she carried herself with an authority that made Vincent's instincts prickle. Behind her walked 2 men who looked like they'd stepped out of a military handbook, broad shoulders, alert eyes, and the kind of stillness that suggested coiled violence. They wore expensive suits, but their hands remained visible and empty, a gesture that was either supremely confident or supremely stupid. "Mr. Torino, I'm Charlotte Whitmore." The woman's voice carried traces of an East Coast education and old money breeding. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Vincent kept his pistol trained on her center mass while his mind raced. The name Whitmore meant railroads, steel mills, and political connections that reached all the way to Washington. What was American royalty doing in a blood-soaked warehouse on Chicago's South Side? "Miss Whitmore, I'm afraid you've caught me at a bad time. As you can see, I'm in the middle of redecorating." Vincent's tone was conversational, but his finger remained on the trigger. "Perhaps we could schedule an appointment during regular business hours." Charlotte smiled, an expression that never quite reached her eyes. "I'm afraid our business can't wait for regular hours, Mr. Torino. You see, there's been a change in Chicago's management structure, and we need to discuss your role in the new arrangement. The only arrangement I'm interested in is who's going to pay for my dead men and my ruined business." Vincent took a step forward, his patience wearing thin. "You want to negotiate? Start by explaining why 12 good men are lying dead in my warehouse. Those men died because they were in the way of progress, Mr. Torino. Chicago is evolving, becoming something bigger and more profitable than these petty territorial disputes. We're offering you a chance to evolve with it." The warehouse doors opened again, and Sally DeMarco entered with Mickey and their team, weapons drawn but not yet aimed. Vincent felt a moment of relief. If shooting started, at least the odds would be more favorable. Charlotte glanced at the newcomers without apparent concern. "Ah, your cavalry has arrived. Good. This saves us the trouble of repeating ourselves. Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you're making a big mistake," Sally growled, his Brooklyn accent thick with menace. "This is Torino territory, and we don't take kindly to uninvited guests. Mr. DeMarco, isn't it? Salvatore DeMarco, formerly of Red Hook, Brooklyn. 2 arrests for assault, 1 for grand theft auto, suspected in the disappearance of union organizer Patrick Flynn in 1919. Charlotte recited the information like she was reading a grocery list. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. DeMarco, just as I know who all of you are." The implication hung in the air like smoke. These weren't random criminals making a grab for power. They had intelligence, resources, and the kind of detailed information that suggested either federal backing or something far more sophisticated than Vincent had imagined. "You've got our attention, Miss Whitmore. Now what do you want?" Vincent lowered his weapon slightly, recognizing that brute force might not be the solution to this particular problem. "I want to offer you a choice, Mr. Torino. You can continue fighting a war you can't win against an enemy you don't understand. Or you can accept a position in an organization that will make your current operation look like a lemonade stand." Charlotte moved closer, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. "Chicago is changing, whether you accept it or not. The question is whether you'll be part of that change or a casualty of it." Vincent studied her face, searching for tells, for weaknesses, for some indication of what lay behind that polished facade. What he saw was intelligence, determination, and something else. A kind of cold calculation that reminded him of his own reflection in darker moments. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" Charlotte's smile widened, and for the first time, Vincent saw something genuinely dangerous lurking beneath her refined exterior. "Then you'll discover that the Whitmore family has been playing this game a lot longer than the Torinos, Mr. Vincent. And we play to win." The meeting at Gino's speakeasy should have been routine, a simple exchange of money for protection, the kind of transaction that kept Vincent's empire running smoothly. Instead, Vincent found himself staring at Gino Bartoletti's lifeless eyes across a table still set for their weekly dinner. The old Italian had been shot execution style, his famous marinara sauce mixing with blood on the checkered tablecloth. "Even they got here first, boss." Tommy Marcelli stood in the doorway, his face pale with the kind of fear that came from watching certainties crumble. Gino, his 2 nephews, and the 3 customers who were here when it happened. All dead, all clean shots to the head. Vincent knelt beside Gino's body, feeling for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there. Gino had been more than a business partner. He'd been one of the few men in Chicago who remembered Vincent's father with genuine respect. Now he was another casualty in a war Vincent was beginning to suspect he'd already lost. "Any witnesses?" Vincent's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the dead speakeasy, it carried like a gunshot. "Yeah, boss. Us." Tommy pointed to a corner booth where a young woman sat trembling, a cocktail dress torn and blood-stained. "That's Betty Morrison. Works the coat check at the Palmer House. She was here having dinner with one of Gino's nephews when the shooting started." Vincent approached the woman slowly, his hands visible and empty. Betty couldn't have been more than 22, with the kind of blonde hair and blue eyes that made men do stupid things. Tonight, those eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much death in too short a time. "Miss Morrison, I'm Vincent Torino. I need to ask you some questions about what happened here." He sat across from her, noting the way her hands shook as she reached for her cigarettes. "Can you tell me what you saw? They looked like businessmen." Betty's voice was barely audible. 3 of them, maybe 4. They came in real quiet, like they belonged here. "Mr. Gino," he seemed to know one of them, because he smiled and waved them over to his table. "Did you hear what they talked about?" Betty nodded, taking a shaky drag from her cigarette. The tall one, he had this fancy way of talking, like he went to one of those expensive schools. He told Mr. Gino that there were new rules in Chicago, and that everyone had to decide which side they were on. Vincent felt his stomach tighten. The Whitmores were moving faster than he'd anticipated, systematically eliminating his support network while offering his allies a choice between cooperation and death. It was a strategy that spoke to resources and planning far beyond what any traditional crime family could muster. What did Gino say? He said he'd been paying protection to the Torinos for 15 years, and he wasn't about to change now. That's when Betty's voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. "That's when they started shooting. Mr. Gino, then Joey, then Anthony. They didn't even give them a chance to fight back." Vincent placed a gentle hand on Betty's shoulder, feeling the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. Gino Bartoletti had died because of loyalty to the Torino name, and Vincent wasn't sure that loyalty had been worth the price. "You and Miss Morrison, I'm going to have one of my men take you somewhere safe. You didn't see anything here tonight, understand? For your own protection, you were never here." As Tommy escorted Betty out through the back entrance, Vincent surveyed the carnage in Gino's speakeasy. 7 dead, including 3 civilians who'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Whitmores weren't just targeting his organization, they were sending a message to anyone who might consider supporting him. Sally DeMarco entered through the front door, his face grim with the kind of news that made bad nights worse. "Boss, we got problems. Big problems." "Talk to me, Sally." "The feds raided our warehouse on Halsted Street an hour ago. Knew exactly where to look. Found our entire liquor shipment plus the books we kept there. 37 cases of Canadian whiskey, and enough evidence to put half our crew away for 20 years. Vincent felt the walls closing in around him. A coordinated attack on his allies, federal raids on his operations, and an enemy with resources that dwarfed anything he'd faced before. The Whitmore organization wasn't just challenging his territory, they were systematically dismantling everything he'd built. "Any word from our contacts in the police department?" "That's the other problem, boss. Lieutenant Morrison called 20 minutes ago. Says his captain got a visit from some federal agents, asking very specific questions about our arrangement. Someone's burning our bridges faster than we can build them." The telephone behind Gino's bar rang with the persistence of bad news. Vincent answered on the 4th ring, knowing that good news rarely called after midnight. "Maybe this is a friend." The voice was digitally distorted but unmistakably female. "You have 36 hours to accept Miss Whitmore's offer. After that, the offer expires permanently. And if I refuse?" Then you'll join your friend Mr. Bartoletti in whatever afterlife awaits men like you." The line went dead with a soft click. Vincent stared at the telephone receiver, understanding with crystal clarity that he was fighting a war on multiple fronts against an enemy that seemed to anticipate his every move. The Whitmores had federal connections, unlimited resources, and a strategic patience that suggested they'd been planning this takeover for months, if not years. "Boss, what do we do?" Tommy had returned from escorting Betty to safety, his young face etched with the kind of worry that aged men prematurely. Vincent looked around the speakeasy one final time, memorizing the details of Gino's last stand. The old Italian had chosen loyalty over survival, and Vincent owed it to his memory to make that choice mean something. "We do what Torinos have always done, Tommy. We fight." Vincent moved toward the door, his mind already racing ahead to the next phase of the war. "But we fight smart. These people want to play chess while we've been playing checkers. Time to learn their game." As they prepared to leave Gino's speakeasy, Vincent made a silent promise to the dead man who'd treated him like family when his own father had given up on him. The Whitmores might have superior resources and federal protection, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated what a cornered animal could accomplish when it had nothing left to lose. The night air was sharp with the promise of winter as Vincent stepped onto the street. Somewhere in the darkness, Charlotte Whitmore was orchestrating the destruction of everything he'd built. But Vincent Torino hadn't clawed his way up from the stockyards by accepting defeat gracefully. The war for Chicago's criminal empire had entered a new phase, and Vincent intended to remind the Whitmores that crowns were heavy things, easily dropped by hands that had never learned to hold them properly. The abandoned meatpacking plant on Chicago's south side had once employed half the neighborhood, its smokestacks belching prosperity into the gray morning sky. Now it stood as a monument to economic collapse and urban decay, its broken windows reflecting Vincent's fractured empire. He stood in the main processing room, surrounded by rusted machinery and the ghosts of legitimate enterprise, waiting for a meeting that would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. Charlotte Whitmore arrived precisely at midnight, accompanied by a small army of men who moved with the disciplined silence of professional soldiers. She wore a black wool coat over a burgundy dress that probably cost more than most families earned in a year, her auburn hair pinned beneath a cloche hat that cast shadows across her aristocratic features. In the amber light of the oil lamps Vincent's men had positioned throughout the facility, she looked like a vision from a fever dream, beautiful, dangerous, and utterly out of place among the industrial wreckage. "Mr. Torino, thank you for accepting my invitation." Charlotte's voice echoed in the cavernous space, carrying the confident tone of someone accustomed to having their invitations accepted without question. "Miss Whitmore, you'll forgive me if I don't consider a threat to kill me and everyone I care about an invitation." Vincent stood behind a table that had once been used for butchering cattle, finding a grim appropriateness in the metaphor. "You wanted to talk, so talk." Charlotte smiled, removing her gloves with deliberate precision. "Direct and to the point. I appreciate that in a business partner. We're not partners. We're enemies having a conversation. Are we, Mr. Torino? Because from where I stand, we're two entrepreneurs discussing a merger that could benefit us both." Charlotte moved closer to the table, her heels clicking against the concrete floor with metronomic precision. You've built an impressive organization from nothing but determination and violence. I respect that accomplishment, even if your methods have been somewhat primitive." Vincent felt his temper flare but kept his expression neutral. "Primitive enough to control this city for the better part of a decade. Control is an illusion, Mr. Torino. You've had the appearance of control because no one with real power saw fit to challenge you. That's changed." Charlotte gestured to the abandoned factory around them. This building once employed 3,000 people. The men who owned it thought they controlled their destiny, right up until the day foreign competition and changing markets rendered them obsolete. They confused temporary dominance with permanent authority. And you think you're the foreign competition in this analogy? I think I'm the future, Mr. Torino. The question is whether you want to be part of that future, or a casualty of it. Vincent studied Charlotte's face in the lamplight, searching for some glimpse of the woman beneath the polished exterior. What he saw was intelligence, ambition, and something else, a cold ruthlessness that reminded him uncomfortably of his own reflection in unguarded moments. Let's say I'm interested in your vision of the future. What exactly are you proposing? Charlotte opened a leather briefcase and withdrew a thick folder bound with red ribbon. The Whitmore organization isn't just another crime family, Mr. Torino. We're a business enterprise with interests spanning from New York to Los Angeles, with connections that reach into the highest levels of government and finance. Chicago isn't just another territory to us. It's a crucial link in a chain of operations that generates more money in a month than your current organization sees in a year. She spread several documents across the table, and Vincent leaned forward to examine them. What he saw made his blood run cold. Detailed organizational charts of his own operation, financial records he'd thought were secure, and photographs of meetings he'd assumed were private. The Whitmores hadn't just been watching him. They'd been inside his organization for months, possibly years. How long have you been planning this? Since 1921, when my father first identified Chicago as a strategic necessity for our expansion west. We've been patient, gathering intelligence, identifying key personnel, and waiting for the right moment to make our move. Charlotte's finger traced one of the organizational charts. Your cousin Angelo was our first recruit. He's been feeding us information for 18 months. Vincent felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Angelo Torino, his blood relative and closest advisor, had been a traitor. The man who'd helped him build the empire from a handful of neighborhood rackets had been systematically betraying everything they'd worked for. You're lying. Am I, Mr. Torino? How else do you think we knew exactly where to find your men, when your shipments were arriving, which police officers were on your payroll? Angelo provided us with everything we needed to dismantle your organization piece by piece. Charlotte's voice carried no malice, only the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing a successful business transaction. Then why kill him? Because his usefulness had reached its end, and we needed to send a message about the consequences of betrayal. Angelo understood the terms of his employment when he accepted our offer. He knew that cooperation had rewards, but so did failure. Vincent's hand moved instinctively toward his shoulder holster, but Charlotte's men tensed in response, their own weapons suddenly visible. The message was clear. Violence would be met with overwhelming force. What do you want from me? I want you to do what Angelo did, but with better long-term prospects. Join our organization as a regional manager for Chicago operations. You'll maintain control of your current territories, but as part of a larger structure that can offer protection, resources, and opportunities you can't imagine. Charlotte returned the documents to her briefcase. Your alternative is to continue fighting a war you can't win against an enemy that knows your every move. Vincent looked around the abandoned meatpacking plant, seeing it suddenly as a metaphor for his own situation. He'd thought he was a king ruling an empire, but he'd been nothing more than a caretaker managing someone else's investment. The realization was bitter as medicine and just as necessary. Then what guarantee do I have that you won't do to me what you did to Angelo? You have my word, Mr. Torino. And more importantly, you have the knowledge that betraying us would mean not just your death, but the deaths of everyone you care about. We've identified your weaknesses, your pressure points, your emotional attachments. Cross us, and we'll burn everything you love before we kill you. The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone Charlotte might use to discuss the weather, but Vincent heard the steel beneath the silk. These weren't empty words. They were a promise backed by demonstrated capability. I need time to think about it. You have until dawn, Mr. Torino. After that, our offer expires, and Chicago gets a new criminal administration with or without your participation. Charlotte pulled on her gloves and nodded to her men. I suggest you use the time wisely. The devil you know is always preferable to the devil you don't. As Charlotte and her entourage departed, Vincent remained alone in the abandoned factory, surrounded by the ghosts of legitimate enterprise and the ruins of his own certainty. Everything he'd believed about his power, his empire, and his family had been revealed as illusion. The crown he'd thought he wore had never been his. It had belonged to Charlotte Whitmore all along. But as Vincent stood among the rusted machinery and broken dreams, one thought crystallized with diamond clarity. He might not have been the king he'd imagined himself to be, but he was still Vincent Torino. And Vincent Torino had never accepted defeat gracefully. Dawn was still hours away, and Vincent had a choice to make. The question wasn't whether he could win a war against the Whitmores. The question was whether he could survive losing it on his own terms. Dawn broke over Chicago like a judgment, painting the sky the color of old blood as Vincent Torino stood on the roof of his penthouse building, watching the city wake up to a new order. Below him, the streets bustled with the rhythm of commerce and corruption that had defined his empire for a decade. But this morning, that empire bore a different name, and Vincent wore a crown that felt more like a collar. The meeting with Charlotte Whitmore had ended as he'd known it would, with Vincent's signature on contracts that made him a well-compensated prisoner in his own territory. The alternative had been death for himself and everyone he'd ever cared about, a threat backed by demonstrations of power that left no room for doubt. So Vincent had chosen survival over pride, pragmatism over principle, and the bitter taste of that choice lingered like smoke in his mouth. "Boss, the morning reports." Sally DeMarco emerged from the stairwell, carrying a manila folder thick with the paperwork of organized crime. At 52, Sally had seen enough betrayals and reversals of fortune to read the resignation in Vincent's posture without needing an explanation. Just Vincent now. "Sally, boss implies authority I no longer possess." Vincent accepted the folder without looking at its contents. "What's the damage assessment?" "Could be worse. The Whitmore people kept most of our crew on the payroll, kept most of our operations running. Different management, why, same day-to-day business." Sally lit a cigarette with hands that showed only the slightest tremor. "Mickey's running the docks, Tommy's handling collections, little Pete's managing the speakeasies. Everyone's got a job, everyone's getting paid, and everyone knows exactly who's really in charge." "Yeah, Vincent." "They know." Vincent opened the folder and scanned the financial reports, noting the efficiency with which the Whitmore organization had integrated his former empire into their larger structure. Revenue was actually up 15% from the previous month. Protection payments were being collected with clockwork precision, and territorial disputes had been resolved through methods that didn't require body counts. It was, by any objective measure, a successful business merger. The telephone in Vincent's office rang with the now familiar cadence of his new reality. Charlotte Whitmore called every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, reviewing operations and issuing directives with the polite firmness of someone who expected compliance without question. "Good morning, Mr. Torino. I trust you slept well?" "Like a baby, Miss Whitmore." "Nothing helps a man sleep like knowing his place in the world." "Sarcasm doesn't suit you, Vincent. May I call you Vincent? We're partners now, after all." Charlotte's voice carried traces of amusement, as if she found his resentment endearingly naive. "I have some good news. The Rothstein organization in New York has expressed interest in expanding their operations into the Midwest. I've recommended Chicago as their base of operations, with you as their primary contact." Vincent felt a familiar stir of interest despite himself. Arnold Rothstein was legendary in criminal circles, a man who'd transformed organized crime from street-level thuggery into sophisticated financial enterprise. An alliance with his organization would bring resources, connections, and opportunities that dwarfed anything Vincent had previously imagined. Then what's the catch? No catch, Vincent. Simply an opportunity to prove that your reputation for reliability extends beyond Chicago's city limits. The Rothstein people will be arriving next week to assess our operation. I trust you'll make them feel welcome. After hanging up, Vincent stared out his office window at the city that had once been his kingdom and was now his cage. The view hadn't changed, but everything else had. The meaning of the streets below, the weight of his decisions, the nature of his power. He'd thought he was a king ruling an empire, but he'd been a middle manager in someone else's corporation all along. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Tommy Marcelli entered, followed by a young woman Vincent didn't recognize. Blonde, well-dressed, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested important news. "Boss, Vincent, this is Catherine Walsh. She's a reporter with the Chicago Tribune, and she's got something you need to hear." Catherine stepped forward, clutching a notebook with the intensity of someone who'd stumbled onto a story bigger than she'd expected. "Mr. Torino, I've been investigating the Whitmore organization for 6 months. What I've found goes far beyond organized crime." Vincent gestured for her to sit, intrigued despite his exhaustion. "I'm listening, Miss Walsh. The Whitmores aren't just another crime family. They're part of a network that includes federal officials, Supreme Court justices, and industrialists who've been systematically restructuring American organized crime since the end of the war. Chicago wasn't a conquest. It was a business acquisition. Catherine opened her notebook and began reading from pages covered in meticulous handwriting. Charlotte Whitmore's father, Harrison Whitmore, served as an intelligence officer in France during the war. When he returned, he brought with him organizational methods and strategic thinking that revolutionized how criminal enterprises could operate. Instead of competing with law enforcement, they began co-opting it. Instead of fighting federal authority, they began purchasing it. Vincent leaned forward, sensing that he was finally beginning to understand the true scope of what he'd been fighting. How deep does this go? Deep enough that the Attorney General's office has been actively protecting Whitmore operations from federal prosecution. Deep enough that several senators have received campaign contributions from companies that exist solely to launder Whitmore money. Deep enough that what happened to your organization is happening to criminal enterprises from Boston to Los Angeles. Catherine turned several pages in her notebook, revealing photographs and documents that made Vincent's blood run cold. Bank records showing transfers of millions of dollars, correspondence between Charlotte Whitmore and federal officials, and organizational charts that revealed the scope of an empire that stretched across the entire continent. The Whitmores aren't just building a criminal organization, Mr. Torino. They're constructing a shadow government that operates parallel to legitimate authority. Every major city in America has a version of what happened to you. Local crime bosses either absorbed into the Whitmore structure or eliminated entirely. Vincent studied the photographs with growing horror and fascination. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. A criminal enterprise that had evolved beyond traditional notions of organized crime into something that resembled a legitimate corporation with unlimited resources and government protection. Why are you telling me this, Miss Walsh? What do you want from me? Catherine's eyes blazed with the fervor of someone who'd discovered a truth too important to ignore. Because I need proof, Mr. Torino. Documents, recorded conversations, something that will prove the Whitmore organization's connection to federal corruption, and you're in a unique position to provide that proof. I'm a prisoner in a gilded cage, Miss Walsh. Any move I make against the Whitmores will result in my death and the deaths of everyone I care about. Maybe. Or maybe you're the only person positioned to bring down an organization that threatens the very foundation of American democracy. Catherine leaned forward, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Think about it, Mr. Torino. If the Whitmores succeed in consolidating control over organized crime nationwide, they'll possess the kind of power that renders legitimate government irrelevant. They'll own judges, senators, possibly even presidents. Vincent felt the weight of possibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. For the first time since accepting Charlotte's offer, he sensed an opportunity to reclaim something more valuable than territory or money, his self-respect. What would you need? Access to their communications, their financial records, anything that proves the connection between the Whitmore organization and federal officials? I have contacts at several newspapers who would be willing to publish the story if we can provide adequate documentation. Vincent looked out his office window at the city that had defined his identity for the better part of his adult life. Chicago deserved better than being a pawn in someone else's game of empire, and perhaps he owed it to Gino Bartoletti and all the others who died for their loyalty to make their deaths mean something. Miss Walsh, what you're suggesting is essentially suicide. The Whitmores have demonstrated their ability to eliminate threats with surgical precision. Maybe. But what's the alternative, Mr. Torino? Spend the rest of your life as a well-paid servant in an organization that treats human beings like chess pieces. Watch as everything you built becomes a footnote in someone else's empire. The telephone rang again, Charlotte's second call of the day, precisely on schedule. Vincent let it ring twice before answering, aware that Catherine was taking notes on even this mundane interaction. Vincent, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Nothing that can't wait, Charlotte. What do you need? The Rothstein delegation has arrived earlier than expected. They're waiting in the conference room at the Palmer House, and they'd like to meet with you immediately. I trust that won't be a problem. Vincent glanced at Catherine, seeing in her expectant expression the possibility of redemption through resistance. No problem at all. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Excellent. And Vincent, the success of this meeting is crucial to your continued good standing in our organization. I trust you understand the implications. After hanging up, Vincent sat in silence for several moments, weighing options that ranged from profitable cowardice to principled suicide. The smart choice was clear: continue playing his assigned role in Charlotte's empire, collect his payments, and live comfortably as a highly compensated prisoner. But Vincent Torino hadn't clawed his way up from Chicago's stockyards by making smart choices. He'd made necessary choices, difficult choices, choices that defined who he was when everything else was stripped away. "Miss Walsh, if I do this, if I help you expose the Whitmore organization, what guarantee do I have that your newspaper friends will actually publish the story?" "You have my word, Mr. Torino. And more importantly, you have the knowledge that some fights are worth having regardless of the outcome." Vincent opened his desk drawer and withdrew Catherine's leather satchel, examining the dictaphone apparatus she'd brought, an ingenious contraption that could capture conversations on wax cylinders when positioned properly. The device was bulky, but could be concealed in an adjacent room with the recording horn directed through a ventilation grate. The meeting at the Palmer House could provide exactly the kind of evidence you need: high-level discussions between Whitmore representatives and major criminal figures, possibly with federal officials in attendance. Vincent studied the dictaphone's brass fittings and wax cylinder mechanism. "But once I do this, there's no going back. The Whitmores don't forgive betrayal." Catherine smiled for the first time since entering his office, and Vincent saw in that expression the same reckless courage that had driven him to challenge the established order a decade earlier. "Mr. Torino, sometimes the only way to stop being a prisoner is to cut your own chains, regardless of the consequences." The Palmer House Hotel's private dining room buzzed with the kind of restrained conversation that accompanied high-stakes negotiations between dangerous men. Vincent arrived precisely on time, noting the strategic positioning of Charlotte's guards at every entrance and the careful selection of attendees: Arnold Rothstein's representative from New York, a federal prosecutor whose presence suggested corruption at the highest levels, and 2 Chicago aldermen who'd been purchased years earlier. Charlotte Whitmore presided over the gathering like a queen holding court, her burgundy dress and pearl necklace projecting an image of refinement that concealed the ruthless intelligence beneath. She smiled as Vincent entered, gesturing to the empty chair beside her with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having her invitations accepted without question. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce Vincent Torino, our Chicago operations manager." Charlotte's voice carried across the room with cultured precision. "Vincent has been instrumental in our successful integration of local criminal enterprises into our broader organizational structure. The federal prosecutor, a thin man named Hartley whose nervous energy suggested either cocaine use or chronic anxiety, studied Vincent with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to purchasing human beings. "Mr. Torino, your reputation precedes you. We've been following your organization's activities with considerable interest." Vincent took his seat, hyper-aware of Catherine Walsh positioned in the adjacent room with her dictaphone apparatus, the recording horn directed through a carefully loosened ventilation grate. The wax cylinder was already turning, capturing every word of what promised to be the most incriminating conversation in Chicago's criminal history. "Prosecutor Hartley represents certain federal interests that align closely with our expansion plans," Charlotte explained, her fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the mahogany table. "The Justice Department has agreed to provide selective enforcement of federal liquor laws, ensuring that our operations receive appropriate protection while our competitors face aggressive prosecution." Arnold Rothstein's man, a sharp-featured individual named Lansky, leaned forward with the predatory interest of a professional gambler sensing opportunity. "The New York organization is prepared to invest substantial capital in Chicago operations, provided we can guarantee federal protection and territorial exclusivity." Vincent nodded at appropriate intervals, playing his assigned role while mentally cataloging every detail for Catherine's story. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking, a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement, with Charlotte Whitmore orchestrating the systematic purchase of American justice. "The beauty of our arrangement," Charlotte continued, "is that it eliminates the chaos and violence traditionally associated with territorial disputes. When criminal enterprises operate within a corporate structure, with appropriate government oversight, everyone profits." Prosecutor Hartley shifted uncomfortably, apparently still possessing enough conscience to recognize the magnitude of his betrayal. The Attorney General has expressed some concerns about the scope of our arrangement. There are limits to how much selective enforcement the department can provide without attracting unwanted attention. Mr. Hartley, your concerns are noted but unnecessary. Charlotte's voice carried a subtle edge that suggested the prosecutor's conscience was becoming a liability. The American people want order above all else. We're simply providing that order through more efficient methods than traditional law enforcement. Vincent felt his stomach tighten as he realized the true scope of Charlotte's vision. Not just the corruption of law enforcement, but its complete replacement by corporate-controlled security forces. The Whitmore organization wasn't just buying judges and prosecutors. They were constructing a parallel justice system that rendered traditional government authority obsolete. A soft knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Sally DeMarco entered, his weathered face grave with the kind of news that changed everything. Miss Whitmore, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Charlotte's eyes narrowed with the focused intensity of a predator sensing danger. What kind of situation, Mr. DeMarco? Federal agents are conducting simultaneous raids on 3 of our warehouse operations. They knew exactly where to look, knew exactly what they'd find. Someone's been feeding information to law enforcement. The room fell silent with the kind of quiet that preceded violence. Vincent felt every eye in the room turn toward him, recognizing with crystalline clarity that his moment of choice had arrived. In the adjacent room, Catherine's dictaphone continued turning, capturing what might be the final moments of his life. Mr. Torino, Charlotte's voice was soft as silk and deadly as poison. You wouldn't know anything about federal raids, would you? Vincent looked around the table at the assembled collection of criminals, corrupt officials, and moral bankrupts, understanding that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but the future of criminal enterprise in America. He thought of Gino Bartoletti, dying for loyalty to a crown that had never existed. He thought of Angelo's betrayal and the bitter recognition that everyone was for sale at the right price. He thought of his father, who died believing his son would never amount to anything important. Miss Whitmore, I know exactly what you are. Vincent's voice was steady, carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd finally understood his place in the world. You're not a queen. You're not an empress. You're just another criminal who's convinced herself that her crimes are somehow more sophisticated than everyone else's. Charlotte's hand moved toward her purse, but Vincent continued speaking, his words directed as much toward Catherine's recording apparatus as toward the assembled conspirators. You want to know about the federal raids? I orchestrated them. Every warehouse, every operation, every federal contact you've purchased. I've been feeding information to real law enforcement for the past month. Not the bought judges and corrupt prosecutors in your organization, but honest federal agents who still believe the law means something. The room erupted in controlled chaos as Charlotte's guards moved toward Vincent, only to find their path blocked by the sudden appearance of federal agents at every entrance. Sally DeMarco, Vincent realized with a mixture of surprise and admiration, had been coordinating with law enforcement all along, using his apparent loyalty as cover for a more sophisticated betrayal. Vincent Torino, you're under federal protection as a cooperating witness, announced Agent Patricia Morrison, a woman whose bearing suggested military training and incorruptible purpose. Charlotte Whitmore, Arnold Lansky, Prosecutor Hartley, you're all under arrest for conspiracy to corrupt federal law enforcement. As federal agents secured the room and began reading charges, Vincent found himself face to face with Charlotte Whitmore, her aristocratic composure finally cracking to reveal the rage and frustration beneath. You think this changes anything? Charlotte's voice was barely controlled fury. You think bringing down one operation will stop what we've built? We own judges, senators, entire state governments. This is a minor inconvenience. Nothing more. Maybe, Vincent acknowledged, pocketing his father's photograph from the table where it had fallen during the arrests. But sometimes minor inconveniences are all honest people need to remember that crowns can be removed by those who refuse to kneel. Epilogue. 6 months later, the Chicago Tribune's headline read, Whitmore Conspiracy Exposed. Federal Corruption Network Spans 12 States. Catherine Walsh had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting, though she'd paid the price in death threats and forced relocation to a newspaper in San Francisco. Vincent Torino sat in a modest apartment in Detroit, officially dead according to federal records, actually living under the protection of a witness relocation program that would keep him safe as long as he remained useful to prosecutorial efforts. The trials were ongoing, the conspiracy reaching higher into federal government than anyone had initially suspected. Through his window, he could see the Detroit River, its gray waters carrying the industrial waste of legitimate enterprise toward Lake Erie. It was a different kind of corruption than what he'd known in Chicago. Legal, regulated, socially acceptable, but corruption nonetheless. Sally DeMarco had received a federal commendation and a pension, his years of apparent service to the Torino organization revealed as deep cover work for an interagency task force investigating organized crime's penetration of federal law enforcement. Tommy Marcelli was running a legitimate trucking company in Milwaukee, having accepted Vincent's advice to leave criminal enterprise before it consumed him entirely. Charlotte Whitmore sat in federal prison, awaiting trial on charges that would likely result in execution. The Whitmore organization had fractured into competing factions, their corporate efficiency replaced by traditional criminal chaos. Chicago's streets ran red with the blood of territorial disputes, but it was honest blood, shed in honest criminal warfare rather than corporate-managed violence. Vincent picked up the morning newspaper, noting that 3 more federal prosecutors had been indicted in connection with the Whitmore conspiracy. The corruption had run deeper than anyone suspected, reaching into the Supreme Court itself, but Catherine's recordings had provided prosecutors with evidence that was slowly dismantling a criminal empire that had threatened the very foundation of American democracy. On his desk sat a single object from his former life, the silver letter opener that had belonged to Big Bill Thompson, a reminder of how quickly power could shift from one hand to another. Vincent no longer possessed an empire, no longer wore the crown of Chicago's criminal underworld, but he'd accomplished something more valuable than territorial control. He'd remembered what it meant to be Vincent Torino, rather than a character in someone else's story. The crown had never fit properly because it had never been his to wear, but the choice to remove it, to smash it against the stone of principle rather than pass it to more deserving hands, that choice belonged to him alone. And sometimes, Vincent reflected as he prepared for another day of testimony against former colleagues and corrupted officials, the most important victories were measured not in territory gained, but in dignity preserved. The king was dead. The man remained.